Welcome. My name is Ed Knox. I'm the director of the Rohatyn Center this year. I would just mention a couple of upcoming events and then pass the floor along. Tomorrow noon, as some of you know already, there's a luncheon lecture in the Chateau by a woman who was instrumental in helping write the Japanese Constitution at the age of 22. And it'll be a very personal presentation, I think, and quite interesting. Tomorrow afternoon, here at 4:30, a lecture on the role of law in China's economic development. And then Friday and Monday, we will have two international studies colloquia, luncheon colloquia, which, as you know, are RSVP. On Friday, actually it's two alums. On Friday, Jack Gill, class of 77, will speak on Pakistan-Afghanistan relations. And then on Monday, alumna Janine Zakaria, 95, will speak on a reporter's notebook, Mideast update from Washington. So we hope you'll be able to attend some of those and stay tuned to the other events that we'll be having in the future. Thank you for coming, and I'll turn the floor over to Nadia Horning.
Well, thank you for coming in such great numbers with such bad weather. I was a little concerned that you would choose to your blankets, basically, over the Rohatyn Center, so thank you for being here. I should start by thanking the sponsors of this talk, the Dean of Faculty's Academic Enrichment Fund, Wanacott Commons, the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs, the International Studies Program, and the Departments of Economics, History, and Political Science. Without their generous support, it would have been very difficult for us to have Professor Pierre Englebert amongst us at Middlebury College today. Well, it is my great pleasure. Ooh, that's loud. That's good? Oh, so you missed the beginning? Oh, well. Oh, well. I can put this on my website if you wish. This. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Pierre Englebert, who has come all the way from Pomona College in California to share his insights on the politics of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. At Pomona College, Professor Englebert teaches courses on African politics, on the political economy of development, and courses in international relations and statistics. Professor Englebert studied in Brussels, Belgium, before receiving his master's degree from the Johns Hopkins University, and then his PhD from the University of Southern California. I understand that in between graduate degrees, he worked for the World Bank in Washington, D.C. I believe the best way to introduce our guest is basically to mention that his work has sparked the interest of many of my students of comparative politics and African politics. Actually, that's an understatement. Pierre Englebert's work has brought excitement to the classroom, imagine. Not occasionally, but on a regular basis. Apparently, he himself has inspired quite a few students in Pomona College too, judging from the fact that he received the Pomona Week Distinguished Teacher Award not just in 2001, but also in 2006. Professor Englebert has received research grants from the Smith Richardson Foundation and the United States Institute of Peace. And he has published several books, including the widely recognized State Legitimacy and Development in Africa. And for you, my students of African politics, you'd better recognize that book. But also Burkina Faso, Unsteady Statehood in West Africa, and also La Révolution Burkinabé. He has also authored and co-authored numerous articles in English and in French, which have been published by Foreign Policy, African Affairs, Comparative Politics, World Development, Third World Quarterly, Mondes en Développement, Afrique Contemporaine, to name just a few. His current projects include 3 books and a textbook on contemporary of African politics. If this has not impressed you enough, he finds time to play soccer every Sunday, and he has some energy left to garden and take care of his 4 children between the ages of 11 and 5. Please join me in extending a warm Middlebury College welcome to Professor Pierre Englebert.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nadia, for these very kind words of welcome, and thank you all for inviting me. And I do want to thank Middlebury College for, I think, being responsible for about half of my sale books, and my book sales in general. So, thanks for keep assigning the book, please. All right, so this is a little bit of a coming out party for me. Because I've been working on this book project that I'm going to talk about today, on and off for about 3 years, and pretty much nonstop for the last 9 months. And I was on sabbatical last semester, and I'm technically back this semester, but most of my students have not noticed that I'm back, so I'm very much on sabbatical mode, hiding a lot, and being at home or not answering my door, and trying to finish this project. And so I got very deeply in it, and you work with the minutiae of some small part of the argument, and sometimes I forget what the big argument is. So today's actually the first time I'm gonna talk to an audience who has not been prepared to some extent, and tell you what the overall argument is. And I'm hoping it's gonna kind of be coherent and maybe make some sense. So that's one exciting thing for me, is to be able to actually introduce this to you. The downside is that it may not be as well prepared a talk as it would be otherwise, and at times it may divagate around. But maybe stick with me, and we'll see if we can carry this through and make some sense of it. Worst come to worst, you will have to buy the book to make sense of the whole thing. So there's a theme here, right? I'm a salesperson. Okay, so this is the working title of the book right now: Sovereignty, Sorrow, Unity, Command, and Poverty in Africa. So the basic idea is that the book asks a question about national unity in Africa. It really takes the unity of African countries as not as granted. How can these countries still be unified after almost 50 years of independence, given the remarkable degree of heterogeneity that they harbor, and given the pathetic level of performance that they have developed over those years? So that's kind of the first question. Then I'm in trying to answer that question, I develop an argument about sovereignty, how Africans use sovereignty in relations, international sovereignty, international recognition, in their domestic relations of power. And from this argument about the use of sovereignty, I derive a model, a system that explains the reproduction of the states of Africa, explains why African states endure despite their weakness and their recurrent failures, but endure in a way that I say produce sorrow. And by sorrow, I have an overall term that captures the idea of poverty, polarization, inequality, and even violence. So it's a very general argument, right? It's the complete opposite from the anthropological work when you go in a village and study, spend 3 years with a few families and make sense of the micro thing, which is very important. For me, just like, let me see the whole thing and let me make sense of the whole thing in a few years. So it's ambitious, it will miss a lot of things, but I'm trying to single out something that I think has explanatory power, and I'm going to try to share that with you today. Okay, so I start with the paradox of African unity. There's 2 dimensions to it. The first dimension is the fact that there's very little separatism in Africa. African states, from a territorial point of view, have not frequently been challenged since their independence around the 1960s. Well, we all hear about South Sudan and, the war of separatism there, and we all know about Somaliland, and those have a high level of salience. We hear about them, but they're really exceptions in Africa, right? In this, so if I move, you can still hear me, right? This is wonderful. You can still hear me? No? No. It's not that wonderful. There you go. So I have to move like this. Maybe I should hold it, or no? You can hear me? Yeah? I'll try to raise my voice. Oh, that's good. So if you look at this this slide, and it shows, it looks at all conflicts in Africa over the period 1960 to 2000, every single year, whether a country had a domestic conflict, a civil war or not. And it looks at the proportion of separatist wars. Now, the only region that has fewer than Africa is Latin America. And Latin America is very different. It has states that have existed for a longer time and has more homogeneous population and has more politics based on class than identity. So it's not necessarily such an unexplained outlier. But what's interesting is if you look at the second column, the proportion of conflicts that are secessionist, that proportion is very low in Africa compared to elsewhere. So Africa has a high propensity of conflict. There are lots of civil wars in Africa, but a relatively small share of them are about breaking the state, about starting something new, about challenging the very nature and existence of the post-colonial state. Right? I find that odd because these post-colonial states are not particularly endearing. Right? So you look at Chad. Chad is a completely artificial creation, arbitrary. Chad, I don't know what Chad has done for the Chadians over the last 50 years. I think nothing. And there's a lot of conflict in Chad. But that conflict has never been about taking Chad apart or starting something new within Chad. Right? That is puzzling to me. This is a list of all the separatist insurgency conflicts in Africa since 1960. It's a very generous list. I put very minor things. If you look at the second line, Comoros, this is like a one-year little coup thing when one of the 4 islands decide to go back with the French. And, all right, well, technically, I have to be honest, it's a separatist thing. But really, there's only 2 wars in Ethiopia, the secession of Biafra in Nigeria, and the war of South Sudan. Those are the only insurgencies that are significant and can be ruled as wars of separation. Right? So that's really limited. And in the book, I study all of them. And you find, as you go through the case, that the separatist claim is often overblown also. A lot of these movements are not necessarily separatist. If you look from a perspective of not the countries but the minorities, this is looking at data from Minorities at Risk, which is a project out of the University of Maryland. And they identify about 320 minorities, which are subnational groups, which may actually be majorities. But they're subnational groups that have a certain level of political identity and have been or could be at risk of persecution. And so there's a high proportion of these groups in Africa. There's 97 out of 300 and something in Africa. And I look at the number of groups engaged in separatist violence. Out of 97 in Africa, only 9 are engaged in separatist violence. So that is the smallest proportion of all these regions. So there's some sort of what I call a separatist deficit in Africa. Now you may say, this is not bad news. I mean, they have enough problems. Why do you, on top of that, want them to have wars of separation? Well, right now I'm not being normative. I'm just saying, hey, I'm noticing this. I find that puzzling that they wouldn't want to break away to the extent that the states are so dysfunctional. But I certainly don't wish more conflict upon the region. Right? To me, the question is, Africa is so heterogeneous. It has such young, non-solidified states. It has weak states in general, by which I mean they don't have a high level of capacity to implement, design policies, to organize collective action. It has many peripheral regions. If you look at the states of Africa, right? Like if you look at Congo, there's lots of population in peripheral regions. Sudan, same thing, right? In Chad, you have groups like that. In Niger, you have groups that are split. There's large chunks of empty territory. And so it would lend itself fairly well to separatism because of the sheer physical distance, the weakness of the state to project its power, things like that. It has very arbitrary boundaries, right? So it does have a lot of groups that straddles boundaries and for which the boundary doesn't have a strong embeddedness. And it has plenty of natural resources. So not only are these groups peripheral, but they're sitting on top of gold, diamonds, oil, what have you, resources that could support a separatist movement. Then there's the second dimension. Not only is the geography of African states not very challenged, but there's also a remarkable degree of affection for their states by Africans. There's a high level of nationalism in Africa, which if you adopt a rational approach, which can be questioned, but I think provides some explanatory mileage, it's puzzling. Looking at different opinion surveys around the world, the proportion of people who are proud or very proud to be a national of their country in this admittedly small sample is higher in Africa than anywhere else. Now, you know, the French are proud to be French for some irrational reason too, right? But you do have to ask yourself, like, I mean, when I go to Congo, I do a lot of field work in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The extent of nationalist sentiment, the pride to be Congolese, is overwhelming. This is a recurrent theme in every interview, whether it's with elites or commoners, people in the village, men and women. And I can't figure out why, because Congo is the creation of Leopold II. It's a big enterprise of predation and stealth. It's a nasty regime. It's a nasty government that has done nothing good for the Congolese. They themselves are very divided in other ways. While they proclaim their Congolese identity, they're also very polarized among themselves. And it puzzles me. There's a nationalist paradox, right? So that's kind of the, you know, after the territorial dimension, there's an ideological dimension and also an institutional dimension. There's an acceptance of the state. There's very little in terms of institutional innovation. And here my mother made me study Latin for 6 years. She was hoping I would be a priest. And that did not happen, but I still have some Latin. Now, I'm not exactly sure what it says. But there's this guy, Pliny the Elder, who wrote Ex Africa semper aliquid novi, meaning there's always something new out of Africa. And a lot of scholars use that, right? Saying, oh, Africa, there's always something incredible is going to come out of there. And I boldly replaced semper by numquam, which I think means never. And if it doesn't, let's assume it means never. So it says, oh, out of Africa, never anything new. And here I mean that, yes, even though there's a lot of new things at the surface, a lot of conflict, a lot of things maybe happening in non-conflictual ways too, there's nothing new in terms of political institutions. The states are still there. There's very little endogenous evolution, institutional competition. I don't know, among some of you, there may be historians, political scientists who've read the work of Sprout, who looks at the rise of the nation state, how it competes with alternative modes of collective action like the City League and things like that. And in Africa, even though the state doesn't seem to have a comparative advantage in providing development, providing security, and improving human dignity, nevertheless, it seems like no other institution seems to arise to compete and challenge it and replace it. Traditional chiefs don't act as, you know, real substitute to the state. On the contrary, they work with the state. Typically rebels, and here I'm kind of skipping slides ahead, but there's a level of passive acceptance. Rebels, there's a long quote here, rebels typically reproduce the institutions of the state in the territories that they control. They don't try something new. It's not like Mao going and organizing the peasantry in a new system. In East Congo, the rebels of the RCD Goma, they got there, they just kept all the ministries in place. They kept all the provincial authority, the governor, the province, all the structures that they encountered. They kept them. They kept the letterhead that said Democratic Republic of Congo, and they used that. They just stepped into the positions of the state, but they never challenged that structure. Right? And then here's a picture of this is Limulunga in western. This is in this region here, the western province of Zambia, and here you have a kingdom, an old kingdom, Barotse land, which was a pre-colonial kingdom and became its own colony. And Zambia is not, a catastrophe, but Zambia is a very aid-dependent, weak state in terms of what it can do, in terms of development. And here you see an example of chiefly collaboration. This is the palace of the king, and you have the Barotse land flag, and you have the Zambian flag. And I use that as an illustration of the fact that traditional authority in Africa is very much a tool of the post-colonial state. We can't think in terms of tradition and modernity with them representing some sort of deeper, more historical legitimacy. Really, they are agents of the state. In many countries, chiefs are appointed by the state. Right? And so it's hard to find any kind of source of institutional competition. And yet African states are dysfunctional, they're predatory, their societies are polarized, the level of corruption is Africans are exasperated by corruption. Corruption is highly prevalent, but people are so mad at it. There's a wonderful book by Daniel Smith that just came out, I think at the beginning of this year, maybe end of last year. Everyday Deception in Nigeria, or something like that. And he works in the Igbo region, and he's an anthropologist. His wife is Nigerian. He's very well immersed in society. And he describes how people both participate in and at the same time are so frustrated and captured by corruption and by the dysfunctionality of the state. Right? The state has failed to bring about development, human emancipation, there's such a vacuum, and for some reason, nothing is filling it up, right? So it creates a paradox. The paradox is, why is there overall compliance with the state, with the weak state in Africa, even by its apparent victims, right? I understand why the president is not challenged. It's a weak state. Yeah, well, the president is doing pretty well out of the weak state, right? Mobutu, never mind Congo being dysfunctional. Mobutu himself was highly functional, right? So, but I'm asking, why does the king of Barotseland, who has a potential claim to be his own guy, to make his own kingdom, right? Why would other regions not decide? Why would regional elites, especially the elites of groups that are particularly discriminated against, or that are neglected by the state, or that have strong cultural difference, why don't they challenge this system? Why don't the little guys challenge it more often? So the overall research question is, why do Africans embrace the instrument of their torment? All right, so the answer used to be, people used to say, well, you know, African states are kept together through the redistribution of state resources. The government extracts resources from exports, from taxing natural, oil, diamonds, gold, what have you. It goes into the budget, and then it's redistributed to friends and enemies alike to make sure that they don't challenge you. Right? So you buy compliance. And on top of that, you add a good dose of repression. And so, like Mobutu is a typical example, right? He puts you in jail, then he gets you out of jail, and then he gets you a lot of money, makes you a minister, and then essentially it kind of kills your potential as an opponent. Now, that's true. That's a very good model. It's this model of the state being one big enterprise of redistribution of resource for political purpose. So political integration comes fiscally, if you will. The problem with that argument is that it's less and less valid as Africans' fiscal crises have gotten worse and worse. Right? There's fewer money at the center to redistribute. Ever since the big crisis of the 1980s, which has continued into the 1990s, the fiscal condition of African states is much worse than before. So there's fewer resources to go around. And so then you have states collapsing entirely. The reason why Congo fell apart was, to a large extent, Mobutu was no longer able to redistribute resources to its supporters. And so Congo broke into a massive war. But Congo was still Congo. So it was split in all these factions, but none of them questioned the idea of Congo. So this model cannot explain that. In the Ivory Coast, the shrinking of the material base of the state led Southerners to redefine nationality in a way that excluded Northerners, saying, you know what, there's not enough for all of us, so really you are not really Ivorians. You're from Burkina, you're from Mali, you're Muslim, let's call you Diola, and we're going to take your identity cards and you're stuck. So you see this politic of polarization, of autochthony, which develops in many parts of African countries that are facing very severe fiscal crises. So this model cannot explain that, because the rebels, the Northerners in Ivory Coast, they get mad, they start a rebellion, but they're not trying to break up. The whole rebellion is about getting back into the system, right? But the system is broke, so why do people continue to demand public employment when there's no money to go around, right? So I think it's a good model. I still think it's a very valid model in many cases. And for example, in Nigeria, where there is significant resource from oil, it does explain a lot. I don't think it explains everything. Then some people will tell you, yeah, but in Africa, the rules of territorial integrity are much more stringent than elsewhere, and that explains the lack of separatism in Africa. Right? Africa has the Organization of African Unity, and the Organization of African Unity has set up in its Article 3, which have then been taken over by the successor African Union, has said that the borders inherited from colonialism are intangible, and there can be no manipulation of these borders. So what? Right? Who cares if they said that? I mean, what kind of rebel is beholden by that? Right? And then since when can African Union enforce any of its rules? Right? And there's plenty of evidence that people violate these borders all the time. Uganda and Rwanda just walked into Congo whenever they wanted to, right? So we cannot quite use that. We cannot quite use this rule, the fact that there is maybe a more strongly stated rule in Africa, that is not a compelling reason to explain why rebels or groups actually respect the rule. Now, the second step, and say, well, yeah, but you could not respect the rule. You could do your own thing, but then you would not be recognized. because there is this rule, African governments will not recognize you. And then, if you embark into a separatist movement, you want to be recognized as a sovereign state. Now, here I agree that the odds of recognition are incredibly low. Right? For all practical purpose, the odds that a separatist movement will be granted sovereignty, international recognition is zero. But I think that's very much true everywhere else. It's not just true in Africa. If you look at, Sri Lanka has been fighting forever and they haven't had any more recognition. So I don't think the odds are less. In fact, I forgot his name. I forgot. Anyway, there's a scholar, a young scholar, just finished his PhD, very interesting guy, who just did a paper looking at 51 conflicts about self-determination around the world since World War II. And he wanted to be more sophisticated and saying, separatism, no separatism. Well, first of all, he found that there were 5 groups, 5 regions that waged a war of separation and that were recognized as independent states. One of them, Eritrea, is in Africa. So by and large, 5 around the world, 1 in Africa, that's kind of a distribution that is not so surprising. It does not suggest that it's worse in Africa. But then he broke it down. He looked at self-determination gains. What do you get out of the conflict? You may get maybe some level of autonomy, some federalism, something that's not all the way to sovereignty. Right? So he ranks that from 0 to 1 in terms of how much self-determination you really acquire at the end of the conflict. And he finds that the average gain for Africa is 0.24. And the average gain for the rest of the world is 0.17. So if anything, you actually gain more in Africa from engaging in separatism than elsewhere. So the mystery only deepens. All right. So I take it that the odds of recognition are the same everywhere. Right? I think that's one of my working hypotheses. And essentially they're zero. If you start a separatist movement, the odds that you will be recognized in the short to medium term are zero. Look at Somaliland. Since 1991, they've split from Somalia. They have yet to be recognized by anybody. So in the short run, it's not going to happen. In other words, the supply of sovereignty is fixed around the world. There's about 200 countries. That's how much units of sovereignty exist in the system. That's how much is supplied. And so you cannot expect that you're going to start something, say, yep, we're ready for being 201. Say, no, we're sorry, we're out of sovereignty right now. So this is important because this is true everywhere. So now this means that regional leaders, those who could be separatists in Africa as elsewhere, they all face the same kind of choice, right? They can be expected to capitalize on regional grievance, and they can be expected to promote secession if the rewards of a separatist state without recognition, right, outweigh the rewards associated with remaining within the state, the sovereign recognizes. So they can say, listen, here's my option. Here are my 2 options. I am the leader of Barotse land. My region has had no investment whatsoever from the central government all these years. We're the poorest region. We're being neglected. We have nothing. One of my options is to say, okay, let's get around, let's put our act together, and us, the Lozi of Barotse land, we're going to start something. I know I'm not going to be recognized. Still, we may be able to develop, to provide some goods, collective public goods for ourselves, some schools, some level of independence, like Somaliland. Somaliland is not recognized, but has provided something. Right? That's one option. And the king will weigh that against the other option, which is to remain within Zambia in a dependent, submissive position, in a position of marginalization with little accruing from the central state. But still, he's an agent of the state and he still gets some benefits from that, and that's what I'll discuss. So for me, I think every regional leader everywhere makes that implicit or explicit decision, do I stay with the sovereign state in a dominated position, or do I go and make the step to the world of non-sovereignty, whereby I can maybe try to provide more for my region, for myself. So I'm saying that when the benefits of non-sovereign action exceed the benefits of partial participation in the sovereign system, then they are likely to secede. Otherwise, they are likely to stay. And then I show the same thing in terms of non-regional, in terms of institutional behavior. You can always choose sovereign action, meaning work with the state, or non-sovereign action, meaning you and I can set up some new organization or something. I show that it's the same logic, but I skip over that because I have a lot of material. So If that's true, then I have this hypothesis, right, that there is less separatism in Africa. The fact that there is less separatism in Africa derives from the greater relative benefits of sovereignty in Africa compared to elsewhere. So everybody around the world makes the same decision, but when they are confronted with these decisions, Africans find that the appeal of remaining associated with the sovereign state, even in a position of domination, even in a position of periphery and marginalization and grievance, exceeds the benefits of trying to go the non-sovereign way. So this is more frequently the case in Africa than elsewhere. That's my argument. And so then the rest tries to look at why that's the case. Right? What gives sovereignty greater relative returns in Africa? Now, here it gets very important. What is sovereignty? What is the nature of sovereignty in Africa? You have to really, when you think of an African country, when you think of Chad, right? When you think of Burkina Faso, when you think of Uganda, what is the nature? Those are states in the international system, just like France and the United States. They all have a seat at the United Nations General Assembly. They have similar rights in international law. They are the same units. They're technically the same animal. But I'm arguing that the nature of sovereignty in Africa is exceedingly different from the nature of sovereignty in a place like the US or France. First of all, the source of African state sovereignty is external. Right? Chad exists only because it is recognized. This is the source of Chad's existence. Chad exists as a sovereign state because we say so. Because other countries said, hey, you're Chad. Here's an embassy, and here's a seat at the General Assembly. It says Chad, there you are, look, therefore you are Chad. We named Chad into existence. No, it's true. Of course, we didn't name it out of nowhere. The French went there and they colonized and they set it all up, and they pretended to have boundaries in the desert, and then they stepped out and said, this is Chad. Right? And this has become Chad. But you have to bear that in mind. The source of sovereignty. No, what is the source of the United States sovereignty? We are recognized by others. We are recognized as a government, as a state by other states. But if they did not recognize us, we'd still pretty much be here, right? And we were here before being recognized. We had a revolution. We had all sorts of, the first 13 colonies. We had a war. We had a whole process of endogenous historical development that was based partly on social contracting, partly on violence, partly on the elimination of some group, on the rise of other groups to dominant position, the creation of state institutions to perpetrate that domination, what have you. And then it became so empirically true that the others noticed. They said, well, you must be the United States of America. Can we send an ambassador and talk to you? Right? So there's a process of endogenous empirical sovereignty in countries like France, the United States, or England. But Chad doesn't go through that. An African country not only has its sovereignty external, but it is entirely based on post-colonial existence. That means you are a sovereign country, not just because I say you are so, but I only say you are so to those who were once colonies. Right? Chad is a sovereign state now only because Chad was a colony. So Chad has a post-colonial sovereignty. So those are two important dimensions. I want you to think about that. It's true of every country in Africa except for Ethiopia. Ethiopia had its own existence before colonization. All the other ones are colonial creations. So the fact that you were once a colony defines the parameters of your self-determination. You can self-determine as the people of Chad. You become the Congolese people. Right? But think about that. Belgians made you Congolese, right? This is very important. And when you think about it, it makes the whole idea of Congolese nationalism even more puzzling. So we can say that the sovereignty of African state is juridical. And this is not my invention. The two authors, Jackson and Rosberg, back in the early 80s, identified this. They said, African sovereignty is really juridical. It is by legal fiat, by recognition, right? But the important thing is that it exists irrespective of empirical reality. Somalia has continued to exist through recognition, even though if you go there, you'll be hard put to find it. Congo continues to exist, but I guarantee to you that once you leave Kinshasa, it's going to be very hard to find the state. And it's going to be very scary too. And when you do find the state, it could be even scarier, right? So, but this is very interesting, because if I recognize you and you exist out of my recognition, then you may as well be a mess and be completely failed and collapse, and that does not prevent you from continuing to exist. Right? Whereas if the United States somehow dissolved into a giant amount of war and chaos, it may very well be that at some point we don't have the United States anymore, but we still have Congo. So even though people have already talked about the juridical nature of African state, they typically use it in international relations. What I'm saying is this. There are very important domestic effects to this. The fact that sovereignty has this specific nature, international sovereignty has this specific juridical nature in Africa, has crucial consequence for the domestic politics of African states. Okay, so here's probably one of the most important steps in the argument. I'm going to be saying this about 12 times, right? It's a very important argument. I used to have a poster when I was in grad school. I found that in Philadelphia for some reason. It was a poster of Newton sitting under a tree with an apple falling, and it said, gravity, it's not just a nice idea, it's the law. Right? And then there were all sorts of diagrams and calculus equations that showed the whole thing. And it made me think, sovereignty, it's the law. Right? What do I mean by that? If you are the institution that is embedded with sovereignty, you have the right to issue laws. You are making the rules of the game. Being recognized as the sovereign, as the prince, gives you the authority to write, to say the rules. Right? You have the power of legal command. Right? You can issue decrees. You can decide on the level of taxation. You can nationalize. You can confer citizenship or not. You can set the rules of politics. Now, this is just a little step, because you may ask, well, are you sure people will obey you? We'll get to that. But I call it legal command, right? Every state, every agency of the state, government, bureaucracies, armies, judicial system, are empowered by sovereignty with the capacity to say the rules, to legally command. Right? It provides the authority to make laws, the authority to rule. Right? So thus, that's always associated with sovereignty. But if sovereignty itself is externally derived, that means that international recognition confers institutions, agencies, and offices of the state the source of their domestic legal command. I have the right to make laws and to decide of the rules of the game over you by virtue of being into the agency that belongs to the state that has the international recognition of sovereignty. You, the rebels, you can't do that. You have gun, you can force me to do things, right? That's fine. I'm sure you can use force and tax me and extract from me. I don't have to do this. I can write the law. I can issue a decree. I can say by decree that this mine is nationalized. I could decree that tomorrow, but nobody listens to me. So if you have sovereignty, people will listen to you. So because African sovereignty is juridical, the nature of power is de jure. Power in Africa is legal. And this is an incredible leap of faith for me to say that, because I'm trained as a political economist. I'm trained to look for material things. I look for production. I look for resources, I look for material world. And then as I did my field work over and over again, I was struck by the legal nature of power in Africa. So power is de jure. Power relies on this sovereign recognition. African political power is rooted in law, in the legal apparatus of statehood. The state becomes defined by its legality rather than by its effectiveness. No, we contribute to that. You know the Kimberley process for blood diamond? Right? Have you heard of that? We say you cannot buy diamonds from war zones, because then rebels go out there and they force people to mine, and they use a lot of violence, and then they get the diamonds and they sell them. And so therefore, by buying these diamonds, we essentially fund violence. Now, if the rebels become the president tomorrow, the successful rebels, then it becomes legit in terms of the Kimberley process. So if Kabila, the president of Congo, he can sell diamonds, and those are legal diamonds. But if the rebels here try to sell diamonds, they're not. So we say that, what's the difference? Well, they're both rebels. Kabila is a successful rebel. The other guy is an unsuccessful rebel. And they both use violence. Believe me, the way that diamond is exploited in the legitimate part of Congo is just as nasty. The Zimbabwean troops all over these regions. And they hold their guns like this, and people are working day and night and are being miserable, are being shot and being sick. But that's the sovereign power. They can do this. Those are legitimate diamonds. We trust somehow that agencies embedded with, provided with sovereignty act somehow in a more acceptable way. So there's a high level of legalism in Africa. The amount of people who study law is incredible. In the early 1990s, 1/3 of all the students at the University of Yaoundé in Cameroon studied law. 1/3, right? You thought we had a problem with lawyers. That's nothing compared to Cameroon, right? And so last week, there was in Kinshasa, so there's President Kabila, and then the big opponent, Jean-Pierre Bemba, who was defeated in the elections. Jean-Pierre Bemba was still in Kinshasa, and he had about 200 bodyguards there, and the government said, you got to get rid of these bodyguards, it's like a militia. And he didn't want to because he's afraid that if he gets rid of his bodyguards, they'll kill him. And that's not an unreasonable assumption on his part. So he kept that. So eventually there was a confrontation. The army went after him, and the army was successful, and his bodyguards, crossed the river and disappeared and got killed, etc. It was very nasty. About 500 people died 2 weeks ago in Kinshasa. And he sought refuge at the South African embassy. And then the following Monday, Kabila gave a talk, right? And in his talk, in his press conference, he said, what is this Bemba guy? Why does he have these troops? Nobody is above the law. But to hear that in Congo, it's like, come on. I mean, you are the law. What does that mean, nobody's above the law? But he was using that, he was like using legal command to crush him, right? I'm the president, I have sovereignty. We have rules that you cannot have these bodyguards. What do you think, that you're above the law? But that when you go to Congo, you know that the law the reality of the law is very fluid, right? But the discourse of the law is overwhelming. And stamps, people put, everywhere you go, you get stamps everywhere. All papers have to be stamped with Ministry of this, Agency of that. There's this continuous physical expression of the sovereign capacity of the person you deal with in government, right? Or now people fake stamps all the time, right? The first time, when I was in college, I was a junior in college. In 1983 was my first trip to Africa. And then I went to Upper Volta. I was still Upper Volta back then, Burkina Faso now. And my professor, Professor Paul Bouvier, said, I went pretty much like that. I wanted to see Africa. I had no clear purpose. I was a junior. I had no purpose. So she said, here, I'm going to write a letter saying, please facilitate Pierre Engelbert's work as well as you can. And whenever you're in trouble, you show this. And then she took all these stamps and she stamped it. It was like, what is she doing? Right? But she knew what she was doing. She had gone to Africa many, many times. And now it looks so serious. It looks so official. And on several occasions, there were roadblocks, and I showed her, like, And I went by, right? There's stamps. There were stamps. Uncle just said Professor Bouvier, University of Brussels, but somehow she managed to capture some of that, right? So this is important. It is important again. Because it is legal and external, the power of command, right? The power of political authority survives state failure. And so to some extent, it doesn't matter that the state is failed. The command capacity of the state, the capacity to make laws and to force you to some extent to respect them or to make it hard for you to avoid them, continues to exist and is immune to the erosion of effective capacity. This is important to understand. The state can get weaker and weaker in terms of capacity, development, etc. But the legal authority associated with its office and agencies does not diminish. But come on, why obey the law? So, okay, now, maybe it's a plausible argument, but we know that Africans are resourceful in terms of avoiding hurdles that are put in their way, right? So I'm saying, if this is true still, how can I use that as an illustration of the benefits of sovereignty? Because sovereignty would only accrue benefits to those in sovereign position if they can actually use the law, right? If people obey it to some extent. And so I show that there are many reasons why people still obey the law, and then there are times when they don't obey the law, and that's fine, because you still need a lot of help to disobey, and therefore the law serves a purpose in creating a hurdle that will be bypassed, and we can all negotiate how we bypass it. And there's benefits to be made in that. Number one is that laws and regulations are pervasive. Right? The amount of legal production in Africa is overwhelming. Right? So you have rules, and you have decrees, and you have provincial decrees, and you have mayoral decrees, and for all sorts of things. And you need documents for so many things. You need birth certificates for everything. You need to get any kind of paper. You need to go to the hospital for your daughter. Where's the birth certificate? And you have to go to the agency, the government, and ask for a birth certificate. Well, probably, you know, there's no evidence of the birth and all that. You're going to have to sit down, negotiate. Right? But all these hurdles, these legal hurdles are in your way. If you want to start a business, an incredible amount of regulations you have to obey. There's an example here of legal requirements of being a taxi operator in northern Cameroon. You need to pay a little tax that frees you, just a tax to start the business. And then you need a driver's license, which is acceptable, I guess. Vehicle registration, vehicle insurance. But believe me, if your vehicle gets in an accident, there will be no insurance benefit whatsoever. Vehicle inspection sticker, and there's no inspection taking place, right? Permit to carry passengers, parking permit, customs receipt for the imported vehicle, and the requirement that the motorbike be painted yellow and that a helmet and gloves be worn. Right? So we're in northern Cameroon there, you must wear gloves. And so what happens if you don't wear gloves? Right? So, okay, this is the law, this is the stupidest law. Let me drive my motorbike without gloves. Right? And maybe the yellow paint is peeling, right? What's going to happen? Stop, the police stops you, you go on the side there. You're not wearing gloves, so they let you rot there, they continue to deal somebody else. And there you are, you're not making any business. You're going to have to negotiate about this, right? So this is a ridiculous law, but somehow because the law is there, it gives somebody in a sovereign position of authority some leverage over you, right? And I'll show you later how that leverage is being used. But the law your life can be made miserable if you don't obey the law. There are so many of them. There are so many such requirements. You're going to need to get that inspection sticker. You're going to have to go to the office of inspection stickers, and the guy will tell you, we're out of stickers right now, but maybe I can help you, right? Okay, so all these things, they're part of your life. So then the World Bank thinks, oh, there's very high hurdles to business in Africa. We have to streamline them. No, these things have a purpose. This is sovereign command expressing itself, right? And I'll show you. You can already have a hint of what the personal benefits are of this, right? Also, people need the law. You may be against the law, but you still need parts of the law, and the law is not really divisible. This is my property. I need to show that I have a land title here. Otherwise, some other guy is going to come and grow stuff on my land, right? If I go to court and I win something, I need evidence of that judgment. Therefore, I still need the law. I can't just ditch the law. That sovereign legal structure is useful to me. So now when do I decide what part of it I accept, what part I don't? I can't do that, right? So that contributes to the prevalence of the law. You avoid trouble when you respect the law, right? This is a quote from a miner in Katanga. There's a great report by Human Rights Watch on mining in Katanga, and it shows the stunning amount of taxation on these people, right? At every level, there's some sort of institution, agency of the state that comes and extracts something from them. And say, well, you can't refuse. If you don't pay, they arrest you, right? So you really avoid trouble by respecting the law, even though the law, you may not like it or it seems very arbitrary to you. Also, it gives you a structure. Remember that the majority of Africans lives at a very low level of material well-being. This is survival, right? And so in that case, you don't take risk. You're being very careful. You look for structures of predictability. You don't want to mess up. You don't want to kind of get lost and suddenly you have no resource. So the law, at least, it's arbitrary. You know that the guy wants the gloves. You think it's annoying, but at least you know how to play with that. So essentially, keeping the law as it is maintains the rules of the game in a way that allows you to negotiate your daily survival, right? But doing away with it creates much more certainty, and you and I may cope with some uncertainty, but when you're very close to subsistence level, you don't put up with it. And then there's the other thing that you don't have to obey. If you decide not to obey the law, the enforcers of the law will work with you. So it doesn't matter. The fact that the law is there either makes you obey it and gives them some benefit, or will give them benefit by helping you not obey the law. For example, if you try to cross the boundary between Katanga and Zambia, you find that there are all sorts of, again, government agencies, health inspection, custom inspection, national intelligence agency, and the famous one, the Congolese Office of Control. But it doesn't tell you what it controls. It has like an incredible mandate, right? And the idea of Congolese and control in the same sentence is replete with Kafkaesque promise, in my opinion, right? So you have all these things. And so each of them will tax you, will ask you for payment. Or if you don't want to do this, there's a guy sitting over there, and he can negotiate a package deal for you, right? So you go there and say, okay, this is too much. It's okay, well, let's talk. Well, how much do you have in your truck? Yeah, all right, 500 for everything, right? You can do this because the law was there creating all these hurdles, and now the enforcers of the law are working with you to bypass it. Right? But they couldn't do it without sovereign legal command. Right? That's still the nexus of the system. All right, so then I want to look at, how much time do I have? I know you want to stay here forever, but... Another 10 minutes. Okay. So now I'm going to speak extremely, extremely fast. So let me stress that legal command. How does it work? There are three main powers of it. Number one, you have the power of declaration. You can authenticate. You can name things. Once you're in legal command, you can name things in and out of existence. You can make things national or not. The whole idea of the Northern Ivorians, right? By law, the president has decreed that we cannot trust that they are Ivorians anymore. That's an incredible tool. Now these guys suddenly, overnight, become completely dispossessed and vulnerable. The Banyamulenge, these Tutsi populations, and actually Banyarwanda, Hutu populations too, of eastern Congo, they were stripped of their citizenship by decree of the president. Then they were given it back, then they were taken again, right? The president can do that. You can declare people in and out of legality, in and out of nationality, in and out of existence. Flags of convenience. You know that Princess Cruises is actually a Liberian company. They fly the Liberian flag. 1/3 of all the tankers have Liberian flags. So you can actually, of course they're not Liberian. They never go to Liberia. But the power of legal command can make you name them. Right? So they can have an arrangement, say, okay, I'll use my sovereignty to make you Liberian, therefore you have to obey all labor laws, and we happen not to have any labor laws. Right? So you can do, this is incredible power. I can't do that. I can say you're no longer an American citizen. I mean, I can say it and you can ignore me. Right? But if Mobutu says, no, you're not Congolese anymore, you really are not Congolese anymore. The judicial systems to say the law, right? This is all, I mean, think of policy making. Governments can set the exchange rate, right? That's an incredible power. Governments can actually issue currency. They can print money. You can't do that, right? Now think about it. They can even create wealth. They can name wealth into existence. When a government runs out of money and they decide to pay the civil servants by just printing money, well, quickly enough, the inflation will eat away at it. So within a week or two, you're going to be in a Zimbabwe kind of situation where you can't afford anything with your money. But for a brief moment, they print it, they give it to you, and they have used sovereignty to create income and wealth. Right? The power, to fix the exchange rate, right? To artificially decide on an overvaluation, that's a sovereign prerogative. Another dimension is regulation and control. The number of police agencies in failed states is overwhelming. Failed states continue to use sovereignty to regulate. And there's no regulation taking place. There's an incredible amount of agencies of regulations in these states. They are not actually doing what they're supposed to do, but they continue to come and make formal demands for you to pay this or have this document or that document. They continue to maintain the trappings of their existence, the outside evidence of it, but there's no substance. But the agency continues. So weakness, you have institutional weakness, you have essentially a hollowing out of the agency, but everybody shows up at work and continue to perform the duties and the outward signs of the duties. Right? So weak states retain a remarkable capacity to regulate and control social and economic intercourse. And then the sovereign command lets you appropriate. You can nationalize land. Most African governments nationalize land. You can take people's assets, nationalize them or transfer them. In Zaire in 1974, Mobutu passed a decree whereby the assets of foreigners were given to cronies of his regime. Right? They were not nationalized. They were taken from one and given to the other. He could do it. There was very little violence involved in it. He didn't need to go and beat up on people. He had said that was the law. Tax tariffs. Rebels can tax people too, but rebels can tax you when they set up a roadblock and they control you and they say, okay, we're going to tax you. The government has a much broader a decentralized power of taxation. All right, then I'll skip this. Okay, so then the crucial thing is that kind of legal command has an exchange value. People can translate this into a personal resource. Right? The command value of sovereignty can be converted into private value by holders of state power. So if you are the person whose job is to demand a sticker for the motorbike, now you have something you can exchange. Because this requirement exists by legal existence, then you can go and say, listen, you need that sticker, and you're going to have to pay for it. Right? Now, the state is weak. Where the money goes, we don't know. But the fact that you need that, if you don't want trouble out there, gives me some power, some opportunity for material resource. The sovereignty of state institutions preserves the command value even in time of weakness. So people instrumentalize the state. Right? They use their position in the state to gain a private benefit from. Now, bear in mind, a lot of people don't get paid. Bear in mind, it's very poor. Bear in mind, people have children. I'm not trying to demonize Africans here. This is very rational behavior in the kind of environment they're in, and you would probably do it too. And when the guy stops you and asks for a few extra dollars because you don't have this paper, well, the guy is thinking that he has kids at home, right? He's got to pay their school fees. He himself is victim of other people asking the same thing. So don't think, oh, these people are so corrupt, there's some sort of moral failure. No, this is a perfectly rational way to behave in the kind of environment that they face. Right? So they instrumentalize sovereignty. So here I say sovereignty is the gold standard, right, which guarantees the exchange rate of public institutions. Even when the state is failed, these institutions continue to have value, and you can still extract resources from people by being in positions of authority. And how do you extract them? By, you're getting income from people, like, judges in Kenya charge, there's like a fee scale for different levels of jurisdiction, how much you pay for a judgment in your favor, right? And then you can sell position in public service. There was an example where policemen in Congo-Brazzaville had to pay 200,000 CFA franc a month to their boss to be assigned a specific region where they could actually, where there was a lot of traffic, and therefore they could do successful extraction at roadblocks. Okay, so you pay. All these positions of authority, there's a market in them, right? People try to get appointed at the port because then it's a lot of trade and you can extract tariff stuff. Right? In Katanga, the guys who guard the mines and then they charge the miners money, they call them per diem. Now, a per diem is what you receive when you're on an official mission with the government of some agency for your private maintenance, right? So I go on a mission, and as part of my mission, I get a per diem of $70 a day, meaning that I get a payment whereby I can buy food and get a hotel. But it's not the actual, maybe I'm an IRS person and I go to make sure you've paid your tax. Well, the payment of the tax is one thing, and then I get a per diem from the government for my maintenance while I do this. In Congo, they demand payment from the miners, and they call it their per diem. Essentially, they're saying, listen, maintain me on account of my official authority. Because I'm sovereign, you got to take care of me. Right? And then there's prebendal domination. So there's the idea that people, like the king of Barotse land, will accept his domination within Zambia because within his own province, he benefits from his association with the sovereign state, which gives him sovereign powers at the local level, whereby he can impose himself upon his own people. So he's trading local domination for national submission. And sovereignty is the mechanism that makes this possible. And here I'm going a little fast, and so you may have to take my word for it. But then that's quite a few people. People in positions of authority in the state. People in positions of authority at regional level. Right? But how is it so prevalent? There's a lot of other people who work in intermediation, who make a living of facilitating relationship between the state and individuals, who make a living of taming this arbitrariness. Right? There are people who may have been judged once, and therefore they sit outside the courthouse, and when you come there, they say, can I help you? Right? Let me know. You need a birth certificate? Yeah, come over here, right? Now suddenly they benefit from the fact that this whole thing is a maze, and they make a living out of this arbitrariness. And they may be retired judges, they may be judges themselves, they may be family of the judge, they may be complete pretend guys who are going to take your money and run away. In Congo, they call it protocol, right? Do you have protocol? Every time you do something, do you have protocol? Protocol helps you through the airport. Protocol helps you when you cross the river. There are people who just make a living of getting you the right stamp, of facilitating that Zambia, getting through the border at Zambia and all that. So that multiplies the number of people who are involved in the system. It's parasitic entrepreneurial activity. These people will be better off without the arbitrariness, but in the short term, in the situation of survival, they find that they benefit from the system right now today because they can get $2 or $3 from this. Therefore, they are not agents of change either. Right? And everybody's got families, so now we have a larger number of people involved in this. And there's a whole idea of, patron-client kin redistribution. When you do have somebody in a big man position, that person will take care of a lot of other people. But the different model between my model and the basic idea of redistributing from the center is that people get sovereign positions so they can extract from other people. They want to be associated with the state, not that the state pays them something, a rent. They want to be associated with the state so that they can benefit from sovereign persona, from a sovereign function, with which they can extract from others. So it's a model of domination. It's a model of regional domination, regional predation, predicated upon connection to the sovereign state. And those benefits are so huge, and Africa has so few alternatives. There are very few markets, very little private enterprise, that these benefits dwarf alternatives. And so if you're the king of Barotse land, it makes more sense for you to, even though your region is doing lousy, to maintain your connection with the state, because the state guarantees your local domination, because you're nominated by the state, you're appointed by the state, and you get some authority at the local level to allocate land, and therefore to remove land, to do some level of taxation, right? So these people that you think, why do you put up with this? Well, they embrace Zambia to some extent because of how they can maintain their own regional domination. So the language of grievance, the language, oh my gosh, the Lozis are really being dominated. Oh, the Banyamulenge are really being dominated. The Igbos are victims. The Tuaregs are victims. That is misleading to some extent because we think of the ethnic group or the minority as the agent. We think in terms of cultural grievance, one group versus the state. But these groups are not homogeneous. Within these groups, there are classes, you can call them. There are dominant people and less dominant people. And the dominant people find that, well, association with the state is not such a bad thing for me to remain dominant. So they go on fighting. They say, we want autonomy. We want separation. And then they say, when you negotiate, say, okay, give us a province, make it a federal government, and we'll be in charge of this federated state. Now, therefore, what they've managed to do, they've managed to extract a multiplication of sovereign institutions to reinforce their local domination. And thereby, they have not challenged the state. They have had conflict. And so you have a high propensity of conflict in Africa. But the conflict does not challenge the state. The conflict typically reproduces the state. And it reproduces it in its domination, in its inequality. It multiplies poles of inequality around the country. So it makes you think differently about demands for decentralization, for autonomy, which we think of intuitively as something positive to let these communities express their own identity. Well, the reality of it, and here, the rest of the book goes into all that. I look at all these cases here, Barotse land, Southern Congo, Brazzaville, Anglophone Cameroon, Kivu province, Biafra and Niger Delta. I have all these case studies, and I show how the local elites capitalize upon their sovereign connection to extract resource from their kin, right? And so I don't want to call it class, because if you call it class, then a lot of people don't listen to you, and it's harder to get published. But it's inequality, right? Right. And so then here I go into details. Then I ask about other regions. I say, well, I hope you can read it. You may have to buy the book, remember. So then I say, but look, there are cases of separatism. But if you look at Casamance, this region of Senegal, which embark in separatism, if you look at their demands, if you look at the text that they negotiate with the government, it's all about having a local parliament, a regional council, a regional executive government, a regional agency of investment. They're all sovereign offices. What they want is that they want to partake in the whole thing. They don't want the northerners to come and rule their regions. No, let us rule our own region. Right? Those are elites who fight for this. The Tuaregs of Mali, especially Niger, if you look at the 1995 Ouagadougou agreement between the government and the rebels, there's like 5 pages of explicit demands of the kind of institutions they want and how many seats there will be in them and what kind of government agencies they will have at the local level. Right? There's nothing about Tuareg identity and stuff like that. In South Sudan, it's the same thing. And this is a little more extreme here. I'm kind of pushing it because South Sudan clearly has some issues of racial, religious, and resource dichotomization with the rest of the country that kind of push it over the edge there. But essentially what they've managed to obtain in the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement is participation at the national level, positions as ministers and vice president, and the building of a local state apparatus. So now the South has its own little sovereign structures. Right? So I go on like that, looking at different cases and looking to what extent it matches that. And then there are all sorts of little things. I don't know what this is. And then I show that nationalism comes out of it. And I'm sorry, I'm going so fast. And then I show that it corresponds, there are huge economic costs to this. I guess if you're filming this, then later you can freeze on different slides and slow it down, and then you have like all the detail of it. It's like he wasn't feeling so well suddenly. And then, so anyway, it goes on. So I say what is to be done, and of course, here it becomes completely radical. And I'll skip that very quickly. And then it goes there. It says, I forgot. The last one says thank you. And it goes right back there. So, thank you. Sorry about the timing. But I hope I've conveyed the argument. I mean, there's a lot of case studies, and I'm still in the middle of all of them. I'm just trying to give you this argument and the fact that sovereignty is very widespread, and a lot of people can have access to it and use it. And it creates a relationship of predation and domination, which is not because Africans are worse than others, because there are few other alternatives, and therefore the relative advantage of this dwarfs some other options. And the consequence of that is that weak, dysfunctional, oppressive states go on. And that's why I think that the lack of separatism could be a problem. It's like Africans have no exit option. I'm sorry.
All right, Professor Englebert can take some questions now, if you have any, and then we will basically split at 6 o'clock.
Yes.
If you're interested in addressing issues of poverty or underdevelopment in Africa, how do you begin to do that if your argument is that the special type of sovereignty in Africa is what causes it?
Yes, so you go after sovereignty, right? So the recommendation, you have that sense of déjà vu, right? It said what is to be done somewhere. There you go. So the basic idea is to alter the incentives of national and regional elites. Right now, everybody has an incentive to reproduce this sovereign, dysfunctional state because there's a huge return to sovereignty. So my recommendation, and I realize that this is, in the range of feasibility, it's very low to 0 on a scale of 0 to 100, right? But I think we have to open up the discussion to this. And that's the beauty of being in a small liberal arts college, right? As scholars, we can say things that maybe will never fly, but if I was at Brookings, I couldn't even say this. But here, at least I can say it, and we can start thinking about it. And maybe down the road, something practical can come out of it. But the basic idea is that can we remove that basic idea of post-colonial sovereignty? The basic rule according to which we recognize you because you were once colonized. And you can count on that. You will always, whatever happens, you will be, Congo will guarantee that. And therefore, there's a huge incentive, right, to non-performance. Like, it doesn't matter. My state is dysfunctional, but I still have sovereign command. Now, can we create incentive to create empirical sovereignty? Can we say, listen, we change the rules. Extreme case. We no longer recognize. So Condi Rice comes up and he said, the United States has adopted a new policy. We no longer recognize African countries. I would be jubilant. This is wonderful. Africans are free at last, right? We say, that means essentially we no longer recognize the consequence of colonialism, right? And so then now, before she leaves, she said, we have a new rule. We will recognize effective polities in Africa. Meaning what? Well, maybe Congo gets its act together, recognize Congo, but maybe the Kivu finds that it can organize itself. Maybe Somaliland, which since 1991 has actually provided security, education, and democracy, free and fair elections. Maybe say, this system is working. We're going to recognize Somaliland and work with them. We're not giving aid or anything. It's just a matter of recognition. Thereby, we empower these people with the sovereign prerogative. We cannot assume that leaders will become altruistic tomorrow. We cannot say, listen, we need to have good governance. Can you have less corruption? No, it's not going to work like that. You have to see that this is a system. Can we change the incentive in the system? And so we say, you will get recognized, and therefore you will get sovereignty, and therefore you can help yourself as you need to. If you provide effective governance, if you provide education, safety, right, some basic level of welfare. So now you make it parallel. People have to provide public benefits in order to have access to private benefits. There'll still be abuse, and people will still skim. There's corruption everywhere. But now, in order to maximize your own self-interest, you will have to provide public services. Well, this is very abstract. In reality, how that would work, I'm not sure yet, right? Because you can go and say, okay, we don't recognize you, and maybe all hell breaks loose, and then everybody kills each other. But on the other hand, if you say, listen, I'll recognize you if you provide safety, you create an incentive for political entrepreneurs to maybe say, okay, let's try something here, and we'll get something out of it. Right? So here I go through different levels of what it means to change the principle of recognition. and maybe no longer recognized states. And notice that Taiwan's performance increased tremendously after it was not recognized, because Taiwan used to benefit, we're America's friend, we can do whatever we want, right? Suddenly we have nothing. If we're not going to be swallowed by the other China, we better show that we can do something. That's when Taiwan democratized and embarked in such growth, right? So I'm saying, well, not being recognized forces you to find another foundation of your legitimacy. Right? Or there could be alternative thing. We could say, well, listen, you can still be officially recognized, but we're going to give parts of recognition to several elements within the country, right? If this province does well, then we can give some, like maybe Palestinian Authority or Hong Kong, some sort of mixed in-between level of recognition, whereby local elites can already derive some benefits. Can we essentially loosen, liberalize the supply of sovereignty? Can we not make it fixed? Can we say, you know what? It's possible. Sovereignty is there to be had for a price. Sovereignty is costly. Now sovereignty is fixed and is allocated by purely historical mechanism of colonial existence. Can we say we allocate sovereignty based on effective performance? So you can have it, but it's costly. First, you've got to get your act together. You've got to demonstrate empirical sovereignty before you get juridical. Now, I realize that practically I have no idea how this would work. Right? But I think we have to break the sacrality of the state in Africa. We have to realize these are not instruments of progress. And we have to learn to think beyond them, below them, through them, any other ways. But we can't be prisoner of the state. African states are keeping Africans prisoner. And they are willing prisoner because this is how they survive. You don't seem too satisfied with that. I don't blame you.
I mean, just from a practical perspective, though, we can't do anything within the framework that's currently established. Is that essentially your argument?
No, I haven't really written that chapter yet, so I don't know. But, if you wanted one simple policy thing, I would say, let's recognize Somaliland. Okay, I think we should do that at the same time, unrecognize others. But if we can do nothing else, something that's practical. We have a separatist region here that has taken care of itself for 15 years. Can we go say, you know what, we're very impressed, and we will send an ambassador to Somaliland, and we welcome your ambassador here, and we recognize you as a real nation. You've gone a long way. Well, if you do that, believe me, the king of Barotseland, the Katangans, the Delta region people, the Tuareg, it's like, whoa, the rules may have changed. We can do this. Now, maybe by doing this, you manage to equate a little more the interest of these elites with the interest of their people, the regional people. I think that recognizing everybody, so it would be opening Pandora's box, right? What do I care? Open Pandora. Why is it so bad? People say, if you do that, it's going to be a chain reaction. Everybody's going to want to be recognized. So recognize them. If you say we recognize you based on good performance, then let them perform well and recognize them. Why is that such a catastrophe, right? Well, it's a catastrophe because there are 50 states at the United Nations General Assembly who are enjoying the current system very well and make a lot of noise. Say, oh my gosh, this would be a violation of our sovereignty. Duh, of course it would be. That's the whole point, right? Look what you've done with it. So we have to break this mold, right? So I think that would be a first step. It would send a powerful signal. So that's a little more practical. Still highly, right, unpractical. But yes?
I had a question with regards to your book, Staying and Developing Legitimacy. In your book, you seem to say that the main reason why development in Africa is very difficult is because of lack of legitimacy. And you have the horizontal legitimacy factor, where you say that if there is one tribe and it's divided into two countries are basically divided into a tribe, then that's very difficult for a state to create a legitimacy, and therefore it's hard to develop. But what you say here is more about sovereignty, and you seem to say that the legal strength that a state gets for the sovereignty basically makes it in a sense legitimate. And also the feeling of nationalism, what you're talking about, how do you reconcile that with your notion of horizontal legitimacy? And because that seems to contradict it by saying that when the border of a country divides the tribe, there is the legitimacy is more part of the tribe and not of the nation.
That's a very good question. I'm often concerned about to what extent I have to have consistency across my books. Right? It's like, can I write this one in a way that contradicts the other? And to some extent you evolve, right? And so you start thinking differently. But this book came in part with a question that I got from my other book. I wrote this book that looked at the extent to which African states were historically illegitimate, if you will, that they were so superimposed. And I said because of that, to keep them together, governments typically use this kind of redistributive policies that buy allegiance, and therefore they have poor a poor performance. Right? But then the question is, why do people embrace these states so much? Why is there still, my book could not explain why people were expressing nationalism, why rebels did not challenge these states, while these groups that may not benefit from this would not challenge it more often. And that was part of the question, observing that, if I'm right about this lack of legitimacy stuff, how come it's not challenged more? Because clearly the system itself, the system of buying compliance has resulted in such poor development performance that everybody's worse off. So you think that they would start saying, well, this whole thing has not worked. So then this argument here breaks it down to below each group. Back then I had, look at different ethnic groups, and some of them straddles boundaries, and some of them are very heterogeneous, and I identify them as units, and I say, well, the more you have of this straddling, the less legitimate the state. Now I say, well, let's look at the behavior of the group, and I find that within the group, there are people who say, my association with the state essentially reinforces and comforts me in my dominant position within the group. And therefore, those who are the most endowed with potential agency do not act because they appreciate the power of command they derive from it. So it takes an unresolved dimension of the previous book and tries to push it further by breaking it down at the level of agency within subgroups. So hopefully it's not contradictory, but it's an improvement. But there may be a contradiction. Yeah.
You still say that a lack of legitimacy is the root of the problem?
Would I still say that a lack of legitimacy? Yeah. So I think that the premise is the same, that the very artificiality and extraneity of African states is a curse. Yeah, it's a curse for Africa. And people have said, all right, but states are arbitrary everywhere, and that's what we have, and we have to work with this, and we can do nation building. I think that it may be that there can be nation building, and one day Congolese will be truly Congolese and will have an empirical state. But the way the system is now, we are not encouraging any genuine process of state and nation formation. It's all instrumentalized, and it reproduces dysfunctional structures. So it starts from the same premise. Yeah, I do think that it adds. You can have a good assessment without buying both, right? But it's really impossible. So you need to read. I don't care if you read them, but you need to buy both. I do have 4 children, it's expensive. College is looming. I don't mean to be cheap here. Also, Africans are not the only one instrumentalizing their position, and so I'm trying to. So I think that they're not. You make a good point, and I do have an occasion. I've been wondering how does that contradict? But then my attitude is that I'm not married to the previous one. I think that it was a good step, a brick in my thinking, and I'm moving on. And there will be some nuances that are different. There would be some things I would write differently now. Yeah. Yes.
You talked about how you thought that, or you've observed that Africans tend to be very nationalistic.
Yeah.
So is it possible for them to kind of break that back down? I feel like it's, over their post-colonial history, they've built this idea up of they're an independent state, and now we're all Congolese, or we're all Sudanese, or what have you. Is it possible to break this back down, this identity back down, to form these smaller groups that would be more effective, or do you think that?
I would think it's possible. I think that nationalism in Africa is very salient, but in my experience, it is not very deep. And typically, for example, I was in Katanga interviewing people, and this is a region that in the 1960s was separatist. And now it's part of Congo, and the president is from that region, and they're very nationalist. But I'll tell you, when you sit down with people and you have a few beers, then the discourse, like, we are Katangan too, that starts surfacing. So there is a simultaneity of a strong nationalist sentiment with parochial identity. And there's a lot of ethnic conflict in Africa. And so, the Kasaians and the Katangans will fight each other while both claiming to be Congolese, right? So you have to reconcile this. So what I'm arguing is that because the sovereign unit is the only unit that is endowed with this legal power of command, the only way to make a legitimate claim of access to it is by being national. National identity is the only useful identity, if you will. It's the only identity that gives you access to the state, that gives you the birth certificate that you need. So then you reproduce that one, you claim it. Right? But then the resources are limited. A lot of people are called, but few are chosen. They're not positions for everybody. So you need to exclude the others. So at the same time, everybody outbids each other in profession of nationalism while denying the others that condition. And therefore you say, well, no, that group, their ancestors came from Rwanda. They're not Bantu, they're Nilotics. They're Rwandans. You call them Rwandans. You call these guys Burkinabe. You don't call them Ivorians. So you try to use the law, or you try to use politics, intimidation, to squeeze out other groups from the benefits of sovereign statehood. So you have the simultaneity of polarization, of ethnic conflict, but the conflict is never against the state. It's all in competition for the state. And it leads to the reinforcement of the profession of the identity. But I do think that if the system, this is one dimension. I don't doubt that 40 and 50 years of hearing over and over again, we are Zambians, and seeing the flag and being told that it's a great nation, and that gets into you, right, through school, whatever. There's some sort of brainwashing, and the fact that the Congolese are like that is testimony to how shrewd Mobutu was to some. So there's more to it than that. But I do believe a big layer of it is to maintain, reproduce, claim the conditions of access to sovereignty. And I think if those rules change, I suspect that the intensity of nationalism would deflate. And I believe that people have alternative registries of identity that it would fall upon. And I certainly suspect that the polarization of subnational identities would be lesser. But that's at the level of what's the word? Guess. Thank you. I was going to say guess, but speculation is a nice word. Yes?
Not that you need my approval, but I think your ideas are very important and very exciting. But I think it's interesting that when you talk about your sort of solutions, your vision for a solution, you're talking about a response from countries like the United States as opposed to an internal response. And that makes sense following the logic of your argument, because what you're saying is what Africans are doing makes sense considering the situation. My question is, what motivation do countries like the United States have to change their policies? Is there something that's is there something important about recognizing African states in terms of Western states?
That's a very good point. I don't really go there, but it's a very good point. To some extent, we say we want development, right? But is it interesting for us to have weak states in Africa? It may be beneficial for the system that we have weak states that have natural resources, and we can work with these people in very informal ways, and we can prevent the rise of competition. So it's very possible that it's not in our interest, in a very realistically defined IR interest way, that it's not in our interest to promote that. But if we believe in promoting the emancipation of Africans and the escape from poverty, I think this makes sense. Now you bring up the issue of agency. Since the agency falls outside, what are the interests, what are the motivations of outside actors? Now, I don't know, maybe, I'm not sure that the government of the United States has any real motivation to do that. I think that, I'm not sure, I'm agnostic about that. I don't know if we truly want development or not. I believe that I want development for Africans, and I believe a lot of people in civil society want that. And I believe that there is a power of agency, that people can hold government accountable, so we can create a constituency. So this would never work, say, okay, here, the government of Belgium say we no longer recognize Congo. But China said, no, we'll recognize you. Right? Who cares what Belgium said, right? I mean, who cares what the US say? If China said, no, we'll recognize, we'll work with you, we'll give you a lot of money, as they do now, they would undermine that. So for this to work, you must have some sort of collective action at the level of at least the Security Council or the main donors. Now how that would ever come to be, I don't know. But you know, how the colonization of Africa ever came to be is unbelievable, right? You look at the map of Africa in 1860, and it's blank as far as the Europeans are concerned, but if there is anything, it's nothing like this right now. Boom, 30 years later, these states are there. This is an incredible act of political imagination, of collective action among the West. They never fought. The Western countries, European, they never fought to do this. There was just a tiny battle at Fashoda, but by and large, they never fought each other. Collective action among donors, among the first world, to create a structural outcome in Africa. All right, maybe it's possible. I mean, this is incredible. This is an incredible act of imagination to have this happen. It's a very negative one, but maybe we can have a new conference in Berlin. Let's do it again, symbolically in Berlin, right? And then we bring all sorts of civil society groups from the West and from Africa, and we say, okay, let's change the rules. And I don't know. This could be a great project to start, right? Could be exciting. So you know what? I realize that I don't have a practical solution, but I think that the practical solutions that exist don't attack the real problem. So I identify a problem, and I'm really, really playing with how to think about solutions, and I realize they're far-fetched, but to some extent, if all I can do is open up discussion of these things, it's a first step. I wish I had something that I could easily sell inside the Beltway, but at this point, I don't have that. But the fact that you don't have a plausible policy, the fact that you don't have a plausible medication doesn't mean you haven't identified the disease, right? So you have to work on the medication. So I'm not there yet, and I could be wrong about the disease too. John.
In a certain sense, I think you do have something to sell inside the Beltway, and it's what's being sold there now. This whole millennial approach that came from our mutual friend at the World Bank, Danny Kaufman, and the Bush administration sort of embraced this idea, if not executed it, which is that countries have to do exactly what you're describing 10 minutes ago, act like states, and otherwise you're not going to get our aid. Yeah. And again, the execution has been a little less than one might have hoped, but this idea is out there. And then as I hear you as an economist, certainly it's a great diagnosis you have here. Well, the returns to sovereignty are huge, certainly. So, but that storyline that we are now hearing inside the Beltway is essentially this: let the civil society and let businesses and so forth allow them to have higher returns, and we'll help you out more. Mm-hmm. In fact, 2 days ago we saw in the Times Friedman writing about this very thing in Kenya, where the Kenyans, with a history that is not exactly of great nation building, necessarily broke the monopoly on telecommunications, allowed broadband in, and then we're starting to see business flowering. So it seems to me that your story is not that different, and I think it's great what you've done, of course, but that you are going to find quite a lot of folks in the Beltway who will say, Pierre's story is like what we're trying to do now. And I think your recognition of Somaliland is another good example of that, too. I don't think it's that far-fetched.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. You're right that it's the same logic. So what Professor Asham is mentioning is this idea of the Millennium Challenge account that the Bush administration has that says it's not conditionality. We're not going to give you loans in exchange for policies. We're going to look at what you've done. We're going to be selective, and those who've done these things, then you will receive funds, right? So it's the same kind of logic. I'm saying if you demonstrate effective governance, then we'll recognize you. The two differences are that the Millennium Challenge account works within existing states. Right? So you say we'll put everything up in terms of performance. We'll try to give you incentives to good performance, and by giving you loans. And those loans are more or less sizable, but they're not like there's actually grants. I'm sorry, they're more or less sizable, but in my opinion, they're still dwarfed with respect to what you benefit from sovereignty in terms of command and the decentralized nature of sovereignty. So you're not challenging the very instrument, the very government which you ask to implement these things. And so they will do what you want to some extent, to have access to these grants, but I am not sure that they are the right unit to do so. And the second difference that, yes, here what's being given is funds, whereas what I'm offering is recognition. Right? So it's a different level, which hopefully actually that part could be solved more easily in the Beltway by telling Congress there's nothing to disburse, it's just a matter of recognition. Right? But I think that you are right. I didn't stress that. It is within the current development policy discourse of selectivity. Like we give to those who perform to a certain level. Now, the level that is demanded in the Millennium Challenge account is already for the good performers. I'm working with failed states saying, your state is weak, but if some part of it decides to do something, we'll recognize you. So it's a difference of units, and it's a difference of level, and it's a difference of instrument. But you're right, it is within the same logic. And so hopefully I can promote that dimension. You are right, yeah.
All right, well, if you have questions, we can still be here for a few minutes, so you can speak to Professor Englebert privately. Otherwise, we should thank him for coming all the way.